At the end of our last video lesson, we showed you a picture of this man, J.J. Thompson, and told you that he was the one responsible for discovering the source of the negative charge that was identified by Benjamin Franklin many years earlier. Thompson did his work around 1900 using this tube shown here called the cathode ray tube. We found it very beneficial to explain the history of the invention of this tube to better understand how Thompson did his work. To begin our story, we're going to start with a man named Luigi Galvani. He was an Italian who did his experiments in the late 1700s, about the same time that Lavoisier did. Galvani was experimenting with frog muscles to try to determine what was causing the muscle to contract. And one day in the lab, he accidentally got it to twitch when the brass hook that was hanging the muscle touched a metal iron scalpel while the scalpel was touching the muscle. It caused the muscle to twitch. And he thought somehow the electricity was flowing through the metal, but the electricity was coming from the frog's leg itself. But a friend of his named Alessandro Volta seemed to have a different idea. He thought it was the metals themselves that were touching, causing the electricity that went through the muscle leg. Volta conducted an experiment in which he replaced muscle with tissue paper that was soaked in salt water. And he sandwiched the tissue paper between two pieces of dissimilar metal. He used copper and zinc. And when we take the tissue paper and dip it in salt water and sandwich it between the two dissimilar metals, we find that it produced electricity. Watch this. Placing the zinc on top of the tissue paper, which is on top of the copper, and taking the electrodes from the meter, we discover that almost 3/4 of a volt is produced. This combination of copper, salt tissue paper, and zinc was called an electrochemical cell by Volta. Even more interesting, however, is when another cell is built on top of the first one, again with copper, tissue paper, and zinc, we find that the voltage actually doubles. Look at that. It goes over a volt, almost 1.5 volts. So that means that by adding layers of these electrochemical cells, we can create increasing amounts of voltage. And that's exactly what they did in the early 1800s with batteries that look something like this, consisting of layers of electrochemical cells placed on top of one another. High voltages then could be created that produced continuous currents that were not possible before this invention. And this man, Humphrey Davy, the same guy who discovered sodium back in the early 1800s, actually built a battery with enough cells to produce over 2,000 volts. And he used these strong batteries to conduct many experiments, some of which discovered other elements, but this one in particular is one in which he placed two carbon rods very near each other and connected one to the positive and the other to the negative pole of the battery. And that produced an amazing spark in the space between the carbon rods, as shown here. The light from the carbon arc was so intense that it was actually able to be used as artificial light. In fact, some European cities used the carbon arc lamps as streetlights up until the 1960s. But creating sparks with carbon rods was just the beginning. Throughout the entire 19th century, scientists experimented with ever-increasing voltages and discovered that they can create longer and longer sparks in longer tubes. And they didn't have to use carbon as electrodes. They used different types of metals. The tube shown here, invented in the mid-1800s, was special because it had almost all of the air sucked out of it with a vacuum pump. And the man who invented it, Heinrich Geissler, discovered by pumping out most of the air and putting a very high voltage across the electrodes on either end of the tube, that the remaining air started to glow. He also discovered that by replacing the air with a pure gas such as neon or argon, that different colored lights could be created. This really was the first neon bulb ever invented. And it's the precursor to neon signs that we see in commercial use today. Now keep in mind that Geissler could only get the gases in these tubes to glow when they were under very low pressure. In other words, he used a vacuum pump to suck all of the air or most of the air out. And when he added new gases, he only added a small amount so that the pressure inside the tube was very low. And it was taken a step further by this man, a man named William Crookes, who with better pumps was able to produce even lower pressures. And in doing so, he discovered that the glow started to disappear, and the more he pumped the gas out, the darker the tube became, starting from the cathode, the negative electrode, and working its way to the positive electrode until there was no more glow at all. But he did notice something very interesting. He noticed that even though there was no gas glowing in the tube, the very end of the tube glowed, which indicated to him that something was striking the end of the glass tube opposite from the cathode. It became apparent to Crookes that some sort of a beam was being emitted from the cathode, the negative electrode at the far end of the tube seen here, and was being attracted to the anode, the positive electrode. And the beam was picking up so much speed that it went right past the positive electrode and struck the glass wall, making it glow. In this picture, we see that a cross was attached to the positive electrode, and the beams actually cast a shadow at the end of the glass tube. The sharp edges of the shadow indicate that the beam is traveling in a straight line. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century, several major refinements were made to the Crookes tube. Shown here, the anode was moved closer to the cathode, and it included a hole which allowed the cathode rays to pass right through it, striking the glass on the right-hand side. Now, because the end of the tube was coated with a fluorescent substance, a very intense small bright spot appeared right where the cathode rays struck the end of the tube. It was very small because it was focused by the hole in the anode. So now, even though the beam itself was invisible, its location could be determined precisely by determining where the bright spot was located at the end of the tube. And it was using equipment like this that J.J. Thompson did his experiments. And one of the first experiments he did was to confirm that the beam was negatively charged. As you can see here, Thompson placed negative and positive electrodes, positive on top and negative on the bottom of the glass cathode ray tube. And when he turned on the voltage on the electrodes, the beam deflected up towards the positive electrode. And since he knew that opposite charges attracted, he was certain that the beam was negative. But this was just the beginning. Thompson spent years measuring how much the beam deflected as he changed the voltage across the top and bottom electrodes. He also experimented with different intensities of the beam, and using new information discovered by scientists named Faraday and Maxwell about the relationship between magnetism and electricity, Thompson concluded that the negative charges were being carried by tiny little particles he called electrons that were embedded inside the atom, and that he, with high voltages, was able to knock these little negative particles off of the atom and send them streaming through the cathode ray tube. He thus changed Dalton's model of the atom from being indestructible to being made up of subatomic particles embedded in a very solid positive mass, as shown here. He called this the plum pudding model because he envisioned the atom to be something like a plum pudding where there was cake, which is the positive part of the atom, he assumed, and little negative plums evenly dispersed throughout it, much of which was accurate. However, there were many problems with Thompson's model. First of all, it turned out that the mass of the electron was almost 2,000 times lighter than a hydrogen atom, rather than the 1,000 times lighter that he estimated it to be. Secondly, it turns out that the positive part of the atom didn't take up very much space as he thought it did. In fact, it turns out that the positive part of the atom is concentrated in a very, very tiny center. And in the next video, we'll show you how that discovery was made.